The words struck like the toll of a cathedral bell, only special people. For a moment, Marianne Holt could not breathe. Her daughter-in-law's lips had curved into that icy smile. Her son Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the floor. And the silence of her own living room weighed heavier than the church stones of Munich. In that single phrase, Marianne was erased, not as a guest excluded from a wedding, but as a mother stripped of dignity. For 72 years, she had believed that loyalty and sacrifice would secure her place in her family. She had grown up in post-war Germany, where every coin mattered, where every neighbor knew the price of bread, where one survived through duty and discipline. When Edward, her late husband, died, she carried that same stern devotion into widowhood, pouring not only her savings but her very self into Daniel's new life. Month after month she wired the rent, $500 without fail, as regular as the chiming of the Rathaus clock. She filled refrigerators, replaced broken furniture, bought medicine, even paid for Clara's new white dress. Each act of giving felt to her like weaving thread into the tapestry of family honor. But now she understood it had all been a veil. In her imagination, she had pictured herself standing proudly in the wedding photographs, her pale blue dress symbolizing decades of silent endurance. Instead, that dress still hung in her closet, mocking her trust. The carefully chosen shoes, polished twice and waiting by the door, would never step onto a dance floor. And the $1,000 gift she had put aside now seemed less like a blessing and more like a ransom, money paid to purchase affection that never truly existed. The insult awakened something ancient in her. In German there is a word, Zorn, not simply anger, but a righteous wrath born from humiliation and betrayal. It burned in Marianne's chest as she stood there, phone heavy in her hand, Daniel refusing to meet her gaze. For the first time in years, she saw the truth. Her love had been converted into currency. Her motherhood reduced to a transaction. Outside, the air of Stuttgart carried the faint clang of trams and the fragrance of roasted chestnuts from a corner stand. Life continued in ordered rhythm, as if mocking her chaos. Yet inside Marianne's chest, that rhythm had broken. The careful balance of duty and silence she had maintained for decades cracked like glass beneath a sudden frost. She thought of her childhood lessons, Orning must sign, there must be order. She had kept her household in order, her finances in order, her son's life in order. But who, she asked herself, had ever kept her heart in order? Who had ever thought of her, beyond her money? And in that moment, with the weight of European history behind her, the discipline of a widow who had endured much, Marianne Holt made a quiet vow. She would no longer be invisible, no longer the dependable wallet dressed as a mother. Something had shifted, irreversible, like the chime of midnight on the church clock, a new beginning born out of the death of illusion. The next morning, Marianne sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup of black coffee, brewed as she had done for more than 40 years. The steam rose in slow spirals, but the ritual no longer calmed her. Her house was spotless, as always, polished oak floors, lace curtains washed by hand, every item aligned with the precision of a Bavarian clockmaker. Yet beneath that order, her mind raged with disorder. She thought of Daniel, not the man who now averted his eyes, but the boy he once was. She remembered his first day of school, the way he had clung to her skirt, terrified of the crowded classroom. She remembered staying up late through the winters, knitting him wool socks while Edward worked the night shifts at the factory. And after Edward's sudden passing, she had promised herself, Daniel would never know hunger, never know the cold insecurity she had endured as a child. She carried that vow like a soldier carries a medal, heavy yet honorable. When Daniel announced his engagement to Clara, Marianne's heart had leapt. At last, she thought, the family circle would widen. She gave generously, too generously. The young couple needed furniture, she bought it. The rent was overdue, she wired it. Clara wanted a new coat for winter. Marianne found herself at the boutique, sliding her card across the counter without hesitation. It is what a good mother does, she told herself each time, though a small, silenced voice whispered otherwise. That silenced voice had grown louder last night. The memory of Clara's smirk, the cruel dismissal in those 3 words, echoed in Marianne's ears as though the walls themselves repeated them, only special people. The insult cut deeper because it was spoken in her own home. On the sofa she had paid for. Beneath the chandelier she had bought. In the living room she had once imagined filled with laughter and grandchildren. Her eyes drifted to the corner cabinet, where a neat pile of receipts lay bound with an elastic band. Marianne had always been meticulous, every euro, every dollar recorded, dated, organized. She reached for the stack, her fingers trembling, and began flipping through the slips of paper like pages of a diary. Rent transfers, 36 of them. Grocery deliveries, medical bills, birthday gifts, Christmas surprises, a living record of devotion. Each line inked with sacrifice. By the time she reached the bottom of the pile, the sum totaled over $33,000. Her late husband's pension, drained, her savings, depleted, her own retirement, jeopardized. For what? For a wedding in which she had no seat, no role, not even a mention. For a son who now treated her presence as an inconvenience, and a daughter-in-law who saw her only as a bottomless purse. The rage rose again, but this time it was steadier, colder. In German, there is another word, Enttäuschung, not merely disappointment, but the bitter unveiling of a lie. That was what she felt. She folded the receipts carefully, bound them again, and slid them back into the cabinet. The evidence was there, but the trial ahead would not be fought in numbers. It would be fought in silence, in choices, and Marianne knew, for the first time in years, that her choices would no longer belong to Daniel or Clara. They would belong to her. The humiliation did not strike Marianne all at once, it came in waves. Like a storm rolling over the Black Forest. At first, she believed Clara was joking. How could anyone utter such cruelty so casually? Yet Clara's lips curled with amusement. And Daniel's silence confirmed the worst. Their wedding had already happened. And Marianne had not been invited. Later that evening, she sat alone in her living room. The very same place where Clara had delivered those venomous words. Around her, every item bore her fingerprints: sofa, curtains, even the coffee table set with fine Bavarian crystal. Each object whispered, "You paid for this. You built this life for them." And yet, she was considered unworthy of standing beside her son on his wedding day. Humor, bitter and sharp, bubbled up in her throat. Only special people, she muttered aloud, staring at the pale blue dress she had bought for the occasion. $33,000 spent. And I'm still on the clearance rack. She let out a laugh so dry it startled even herself. In another world, perhaps she would have screamed or wept. Instead, she laughed, like a woman reading her own obituary in the morning paper. The next morning brought no comfort. Instead, it brought proof. Her neighbor Evelyn, with trembling hands, showed Marianne the wedding photographs circulating on social media. There was Daniel, smiling stiffly. There was Clara, radiant in the white gown Marianne had secretly financed. And there, surrounding them, were Clara's parents, Clara's siblings, Clara's cousins, all raising glasses of champagne in celebration. Not a single image showed Marianne. She had not only been excluded, she had been erased. She closed the laptop with a slow, deliberate click. The silence in her kitchen became suffocating, pressing against her chest. For a long moment, she simply sat there, listening to the tick of the wall clock, her heart pounding in rhythm. Finally, she whispered, "So that is my place. Invisible." Her words hung in the air like smoke, then dissolved into resolve. Marianne understood now. She had been financing her own disappearance. Every rent payment, every grocery delivery, every small favor, had not brought her closer to her son, they had made her disposable. And yet, here is the irony that made her lips twitch again: when rent was due, when the landlord came knocking, when the fridge was empty, who was suddenly special again? 7 days later, right on cue, the phone rang. Clara's voice quivered with false sweetness. "Marianne, the rent is overdue. The landlord is threatening eviction. You must have forgotten the transfer." Marianne paused, holding the phone against her ear, savoring the moment like a conductor waiting to strike the first note. Then, with icy calm, she replied, "Didn't I tell you? I only help special people." The silence that followed was exquisite, an opera of panic performed on the other end of the line. For the first time, it was Clara who trembled, not Marianne. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Marianne wondered if the line had gone dead. Then Clara's voice broke through. Sharp but trembling, like porcelain cracking under pressure. "Marianne, I don't understand," she stammered. "We were always special to you. You always said you loved us like your own children." Marianne almost laughed again. What a performance. Clara had perfected the role of dutiful daughter-in-law when money was on the line. But Marianne now recognized the false notes in every word. Love, to Clara, was just another currency. Her reply came cold and deliberate. "Special? Clara, you excluded me from the most important day of my son's life. You used my money for your dress, your honeymoon, your rings, and still, I was invisible. Tell me, is that what special looks like?" For the first time in years, Marianne heard Clara falter. Her voice wavered, desperate, reaching for a script that no longer worked. "We were under pressure. We didn't mean to hurt you. Daniel and I, we just thought it was better this way. Please, don't abandon us now." Abandon. The word stabbed Marianne like a twisted joke. Who had abandoned whom? She thought of the empty chair at the wedding, the untouched blue dress in her closet, the photographs online where she was nothing more than a ghost. Abandon? She whispered to herself. Then, louder, with steel in her tone, "Clara, I abandoned myself for 3 years so you could live comfortably. That ends now." She hung up the phone. The click echoed in the room like the closing of a heavy church door. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The ticking clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, her own breathing, steady and calm. It was the silence of a battlefield after the smoke clears, heavy, yet cleansing. And then, to her own surprise, Marianne smiled. It was not joy, not exactly. It was relief. For the first time, she had drawn a line. She had spoken words that could not be unsaid. Humor crept in, bitter but freeing. 3 years of financing a honeymoon that never ends. She murmured, "Perhaps now they'll discover what work tastes like. I hear it's not so sweet as champagne." She poured herself a second cup of coffee, stronger this time, and savored its bitterness. It matched her mood perfectly. What about you, dear listener? If someone had erased you from their wedding but remembered you when the bills arrived, would you forgive? Or would you, like Marianne, finally close the door? That night, she slept with a clarity she had not known in years. No phone calls, no transfers, no frantic rush to rescue. Only the rhythm of her own breathing, the quiet of her own home. For once, Marianne was not waiting for anyone. The receipts lay before her like silent witnesses. Marianne had stacked them neatly over the years, every transfer, every grocery delivery, every emergency loan that was never repaid. She had always been orderly, it was the German in her. Now, that discipline became her weapon. She picked up the first bundle. Rent transfers, 36 slips, each for $500. She whispered the math aloud, her voice tight, as though speaking it made the betrayal more real. 18,000, for a flat where I was never welcome. She let out a dry laugh. At least the landlord thinks I'm reliable. Someone should. Next stack, food and supplies. Each line item recalled an afternoon of pushing heavy carts, filling refrigerators that were not hers, shelves she never reached into. $200 a month. 3 years, 7,200, she murmured. Her pen scratched across the page, tallying like an accountant of broken promises. Birthday gifts, Christmas gifts, anniversary surprises, 3,000 in total. She paused here, her eyes softening for a moment. She had chosen those gifts carefully, hoping to buy not just smiles but love. How naive it looked now. Staring back in ink. Medical emergencies, $800. A car loan, $2,500. An air conditioner repair, $600. Furniture for the living room, $1,200. Each number bled into the next until the sum glared at her from the page, $33,400. Marianne stared at the figure for a long time. $33,400. Enough to travel across Europe twice. Enough to renovate her home. Enough to buy peace in her old age. And she had spent it trying to purchase affection that never truly existed. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the room was heavy. But in that silence was truth. She felt both foolish and furious. Betrayed and oddly liberated. The numbers had stripped away illusion. It was not just a little help here and there. It was a lifetime savings. Dark humor bubbled up again. Perhaps I should send them an invoice, she muttered, tapping the pen against the paper. Line 1. Rent for 3 years. Line 2. Emotional labor. Line 3. The privilege of calling me Mom when convenient. She chuckled, but her eyes burned with unshed tears. Then came the stillness, a long pause, the tick of the clock, steady and calm, as if to say, now you see, now you know. Marianne closed her notebook, folded her hands, and whispered to herself, never again. If you were in Marianne's place, staring at $33,000 gone, would you feel more angry or more ashamed? And would you ever give them another cent? That night, she placed the receipts back in the cabinet, not as a record of shame, but as evidence that she had given, and given, and given until there was nothing left to take. Tomorrow, she knew, the fight would grow sharper. But tonight, she allowed herself one rare victory, the victory of truth. The next morning, Marianne dressed with unusual care. A black wool coat, her late husband Edward's scarf draped neatly around her neck, and polished leather shoes. She looked into the mirror before leaving and almost did not recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes carried a sharpness she had not seen in decades. It was as though the fog had lifted. The walk to the bank felt like marching toward a battlefield. Every step clicked against the cobblestones of Stuttgart with steady rhythm. For 3 years, her feet had carried her here out of habit, out of obligation. Today, they carried her here for freedom. Inside the Central Trust branch, the air smelled of polished wood and faint coffee. The familiar figure of Mr. Klein, the branch manager, rose from his desk. He had known her for years, had processed every one of those transfers as reliably as the bells of the town square. Mrs. Holt, he said warmly, you're here for the monthly transfer? For a heartbeat, Marianne nearly faltered. The words carried such routine, such expectation. It would have been so easy to nod, to surrender, to let the machine of habit keep grinding. But then she remembered Clara's smirk, Daniel's silence, the wedding photos filled with strangers. No, Marianne said firmly, her voice surprised even her. Resonant in the marble room. I am here to cancel them. All of them. Every automatic transfer. Mr. Klein blinked, caught off guard. Cancel? Mrs. Holt, forgive me, but for 3 years these payments have been as regular as sunrise. Has something happened? Yes, Marianne replied, her lips curling into the faintest smile. I finally opened my eyes. The silence that followed felt almost ceremonial. Mr. Klein studied her, then nodded with solemn respect. Very well, I'll prepare the documents. But may I ask, do you feel safe? Mrs. Holt? I've seen many people pressured into decisions. Safe. The word rolled in her mind. For years she had been anything but safe, financially drained, emotionally exploited. And yet here, in this sterile office, with the pen in her hand, she felt safer than she ever had. She signed the forms with a flourish. With each stroke of ink, she could almost hear chains snapping, one by one. As Mr. Klein handed her the final confirmation, her phone buzzed in her bag. Daniel's name lit up the screen, followed by Clarice. Marianne let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times, then silence. For the first time, she did not feel guilt. She felt free. Dark humor warmed her chest. If they want money so badly, she thought, perhaps they can marry another mother. What about you? Would you have had the courage to walk into the bank and cut them off? Or would guilt have chained you to those transfers forever? When Marianne stepped back onto the street, the winter air felt different, crisper, cleaner. She tightened Edward's scarf around her neck, lifted her chin, and walked home with a new rhythm. The war had just begun. But for once, she was not marching to someone else's drum. She was marching to her own. The knock came at dusk. Sharp and insistent. Marianne knew before she even looked at the camera feed. Daniel's car, Clara's little hatchback, and a third sleek black sedan parked crookedly outside her gate. Her stomach tightened. Visitors uninvited were never bearers of good news. When she opened the door, the tableau was almost theatrical. Daniel slouched on her sofa, head in his hands like a punished schoolboy. Clara paced the room in heels too loud for her wooden floors. Her movements jerky, impatient, and at the dining table, Flipping through Marianne's personal documents as if they were his own, sat a man in a gray suit. His thin smile made her skin crawl. What is happening here? Marianne's voice was steadier than her pulse. Clara pounced first. Oh, thank God you're here. Renata, we must talk. This is Mr. Fisher from the law firm. He's here to help with your situation. My situation? Marianne set her handbag down carefully, as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. What situation? I'm doing just fine. Daniel finally looked up. His eyes, once those of the boy who clung to her skirt on stormy nights, now glimmered with something else, panic. Mom, you cancelled the transfers. Mr. Fisher says it's concerning. We're just worried you're not thinking clearly. Mr. Fisher rose smoothly, extending a hand Marianne ignored. Mrs. Holt, I am a family attorney. Your children have expressed serious concerns about your mental stability. We believe assigning a temporary power of attorney would. Power of attorney? Marianne cut him off, snatching the papers from the table before he could react. Her hands trembled only slightly. She didn't even read them. Instead, she hurled the folder straight into the trash bin beside her cabinet. The slap of leather against metal rang like a gunshot. The room froze. Clara's painted smile cracked, slipping into fury. You can't do this to us. We made plans. We have obligations, debts, based on my money. Marianne snapped. Not my love, not my company, just my money. For a moment, the absurdity struck her and she almost laughed. Imagine, she thought, my own son hiring a stranger to certify me insane. All because the ATM ran out of bills. The humor was bitter, but it steadied her. Mr. Fisher cleared his throat. Mrs. Holt, irrational defiance is often a sign of cognitive decline. If you simply sign, enough. Her voice thundered through the house, startling even herself. I am not confused. I am not senile. I am finally, gloriously clear. And you, she pointed at Daniel. Then Clara will leave my house. Now. Daniel stood, his face twisted into a boyish tantrum. Mom, you'll regret this. Who's going to take care of you when you're old and alone? Marianne inhaled deeply. The room fell into a heavy silence. And with a calm sharper than any scream, she answered, I already am alone. The difference now is, this time, it's my choice. If it were your mother in Marianne's place, would you defend her right to say no, or would you take the lawyer's side and call her confused? Be honest. The front door slammed behind them. Marianne stood in her living room, her chest heaving, surrounded by a silence so complete it felt holy. Not loneliness, not loss, freedom. The courthouse smelled of varnished wood and cold ambition. Marianne walked in wearing her sharpest black suit, every step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. At 71, she had never set foot in a courtroom, yet here she was. Accused not of crime, but of incompetence by her own son. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table in a brand new suit, one he could not possibly afford without her money. Clara clutched his hand like an actress awaiting her cue. Their lawyer, a silver-haired fox with years of manipulation etched into his posture, rose with confidence. Your Honor, he began, we are here today because Mrs. Marianne Holt has displayed erratic, paranoid, and self-destructive behaviors. She has cut off all support to her only family, installed unnecessary surveillance as though under siege, and isolated herself under the influence of opportunistic strangers. We seek guardianship, not out of greed, but out of love. Every word dripped poison, sugar-coated in concern. Marianne's attorney, Mr. Weber, said nothing yet. He waited, his silence a weapon. The performance began. Clara took the stand first, tears glistening under the fluorescent lights. She was like a second mother to me. She sobbed, but now she pushes us away. She imagines betrayals. She doesn't recognize the people who love her. Her voice cracked in practiced despair. Daniel followed. His tone was steady, but his eyes betrayed the tremor of desperation. My mother has always been generous, but lately she has become hostile. She is manipulated. We fear she is no longer able to make rational decisions. We only want to protect her. Marianne's jaw clenched. Protect her? These were the same people who had ransacked her dining table with a stranger in a gray suit. Then came the so-called witnesses. Mr. Davis, the spiteful neighbor, described her paranoid installation of cameras, her erratic yelling in the street. Mr. Green, The pharmacist nervously confirmed she purchased irregular medications, words twisted from truth. Each statement felt like a nail hammered into the coffin they were building for her. Finally, Mr. Weber rose, calm, measured, but with a blade hidden in his voice. Your Honor, my client is 71. But she is not frail. She is not incompetent. She is, in fact, sharper than many half her age. What we see here is not confusion but clarity, the clarity of a woman who has finally refused to be exploited. He called his witnesses, Dr. Moore, the psychiatrist, who presented flawless cognitive test results, Mr. Green again, this time forced to admit he had been misled by Clara's manipulation, Mr. Summer, the hardware store owner, who testified how rational and deliberate Marianne had been when canceling her transfers. Then Marianne herself took the stand. Her voice did not waver. She spoke of the $33,000 spent over 3 years. The exclusion from her son's wedding. The pressure to sign away her autonomy. I am not confused, she said, her eyes boring into the judge's. I am not irrational. I have simply decided that my life and my money are mine. The room hung in silence. Every lie, every fabrication Clara and Daniel had woven now trembled under the weight of truth. Judge Miller leaned forward. His face was grave, but his tone left no doubt. After reviewing the evidence, this court finds no basis for guardianship. Mrs. Holt is fully competent. What I do see is financial exploitation by the plaintiffs. The gavel struck, a single sound, yet it shattered the scheme Clara and Daniel had built for months. Marianne closed her eyes, not in weakness, but in triumph. She had not only defended her sanity, she had reclaimed her dignity. When the heavy doors of the courthouse closed behind her, Marianne felt the cold winter air sweep over her face like baptism. It was not just air, it was freedom itself. Crisp and unburdened. For weeks she had carried the weight of accusation, betrayal, and fear of losing everything. Now, with a single strike of the gavel, the chains had fallen away. Mr. Weber walked beside her in silence, carrying his briefcase as though it contained the spoils of battle. At the steps, he paused, gave her a respectful nod, and said simply, "You fought with dignity today. Go live now, Mrs. Holt." Then he disappeared into the crowd, leaving her standing alone under the pale afternoon sun. For the first time in years, solitude felt like a friend. The drive home was slow, unhurried. She passed the park where she had once pushed Daniel on the swings, his small hands clapping with joy. She passed the bakery where she used to buy sweet rolls for Clara, who had giggled and called her the best mother-in-law in the world. The memories no longer stabbed her. They floated by like faded postcards, remnants of a story that was no longer hers to carry. At home, the silence embraced her like an old companion. No phones ringing, no demands, no voices dripping with false sweetness. Just her own breath, steady and calm. She placed her handbag on the table, removed her coat, and let herself collapse into the armchair by the window. For once, the chair did not feel like a throne of loneliness but a seat of victory. The garden outside shimmered under a thin frost. She watched a sparrow hop along the stone path, pecking lightly at invisible crumbs. So simple, so alive. Marianne found herself smiling, a real smile. Unforced, unbought. She rose, went to the kitchen, and brewed a pot of tea. Not the rushed, half-forgotten cups she had drunk while calculating Clara's rent or Daniel's bills, but a ritual for herself. She poured it into her finest porcelain, the set Edward had given her on their anniversary decades ago. She had locked it away all these years, saving it for special occasions. Today, she decided, was special enough. As the steam curled upward, Marianne closed her eyes and listened. The house was quiet, yet the silence was not empty. It was full of possibility, of mornings and evenings that belonged only to her. For the first time in a long time, she whispered not to Edward's memory, not to her absent son, but to herself, "You are enough." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, like a prayer. That night, she slept without fear, no anxious thoughts, no restless tossing, just the deep, unbroken sleep of a woman who had faced the storm and returned stronger. The following weeks unfolded like pages from a book Marianne had never allowed herself to read. For decades, her life had been written in the margins of others' needs. Now, for the first time, she was the author. She began simply. A haircut at the salon she had avoided for years because Clara always needed something more urgent. The stylist, a young woman with sharp eyes and a quick laugh, draped the cape around her shoulders and said, "So, what are we doing today?" "Something bold," Marianne replied before she could stop herself. And bold it was, shorter, lighter, a cut that revealed her face instead of hiding it. When the stylist spun her around to face the mirror, Marianne hardly recognized the woman staring back. There was color in her cheeks, sparkle in her eyes, a different kind of beauty, the kind that came not from youth, but from freedom. She bought herself a dress. Too, not a practical one, not a, "maybe Clara will borrow this," dress. No, this was silk, deep burgundy, the color of wine shared in laughter, not tears. She wore it one evening to dinner with her neighbor Eleanor, who whistled low and said, "My dear, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were going on a date." Marianne laughed, the sound surprising her. "Maybe I'm dating myself," she said, and for the first time, the joke did not taste bitter but sweet. She visited Edward's grave more often, but no longer with guilt pressing on her chest. She brought flowers, bright sunflowers, his favorite, and spoke not of burdens, but of plans. "I'm traveling soon, my love," she whispered to the stone. "Not because I'm running from pain, but because I finally want to see the world with my own eyes." And she did. A weekend trip to Munich, walking through the Christmas markets with warm mulled wine in her hands. A train ride to Vienna, where she stood in the opera house balcony, letting the music fill her bones. She kept her phone off most of the time, no more anxious glances at missed calls. No more dreading Daniel's name lighting the screen. At night, she painted again. The easel had been shoved in the corner for years, buried under boxes of Clara's temporary storage. Now it stood proudly in the living room, covered in colors Marianne once thought she had lost. She painted flowers, skies, even a self-portrait. The lines on her face no longer seemed burdens, they were stories, etched in honesty. Eleanor often joined her, sometimes bringing friends from the garden club. They laughed, drank coffee, and swapped stories of battles fought with selfish relatives. The sisterhood of survivors, they called themselves half-jokingly. Marianne cherished it. For the first time, she had company that asked nothing of her wallet, only of her presence. One evening, as she closed her sketchbook and leaned back in her chair, she thought, "So this is what it feels like to live. Not survive, not sacrifice, simply live." The silence in her house no longer echoed. It sang. The knock came again, late evening this time, when Marianne was rinsing her paintbrushes in a jar of cloudy water. For weeks, she had grown accustomed to quiet rhythms, tea in the morning, painting in the afternoon, reading in the evenings, but the sound of fists pounding against her door broke that peace like shattered glass. She didn't need the cameras to know. Still, she looked. Daniel and Clara stood on the porch, their faces pale under the porch light. Their clothes, once impeccable, looked rumpled. Clara's lipstick was smudged, Daniel's tie hung crooked, his eyes sunken. She didn't move. For a long moment, she simply watched them through the monitor, a queen observing trespassers at her gate. Finally, she opened the door just enough to let her words out. "What do you want?" Daniel's voice cracked, no longer the rehearsed steadiness of the courtroom. "Mom, please, we need to talk." Clara pushed forward, her usual confidence fraying at the edges. "The rent, the car payments, everything is collapsing. They're threatening eviction. We have nowhere to go." Marianne studied them. These were not the proud manipulators who had stood against her in court. They were smaller now, shrunken by their own debts, their own illusions of entitlement. "You should have thought of that before hiring lawyers to declare me insane," she said, her tone razor sharp. Clara's composure cracked. Tears streaked down her cheeks, though Marianne couldn't tell if they were genuine or just another performance. "We were desperate. We made mistakes. But we're family. Family forgives." Marianne almost laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh that never left her throat. Forgiveness? They had mistaken her mercy for weakness for too long. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice to a pleading whisper. "Please, just one more month. Just until we get back on our feet." You're all we have left. The irony struck her like lightning. For years, she had been all they had, and they had treated her like nothing more than a vault with a heartbeat. Now, stripped of their schemes, they finally admitted it. Mary Ann's hands tightened on the doorframe. She felt the old guilt stir inside her. The mother's instinct to shield. To rescue. But she smothered it. Slowly. Deliberately. No, she said at last. A single word, yet it carried the weight of 3 decades. I warned you. I only help special people. And you made it clear, I am not special to you. Clara gasped, her painted nails clutching Daniel's arm. Daniel's eyes flashed with the panic of a drowning man denied a lifeline. Mom, he whispered hoarsely, you'll regret this. Mary Ann met his gaze without flinching. No, Daniel, for the first time in my life. I won't. She closed the door. The lock clicked into place like a gavel's strike, sealing not just the night, but the end of an era. Inside, her heart pounded, but the silence that followed was not fear. It was victory. The following nights were restless, but not because of fear. Mary Ann had changed the locks, installed the cameras, fortified her home like a fortress. Yet the pounding presence of Daniel and Clara lingered like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. It came without warning. At 2 a.m., the sharp crack of glass shattered the silence. Mary Ann sat bolt upright in bed. The cameras blinked awake on her phone screen. Daniel. His face twisted with drunken rage, smashing a flower pot against her side window. Clara hovered behind him, frantic, whispering, urging him on. Adrenaline surged through Mary Ann's veins. Cold and precise. She did not scream. She did not rush. She reached calmly for the phone and pressed a single button, direct line to the police. Programmed weeks ago under Mr. Weber's advice. Downstairs, Daniel's voice rang through the night like a wounded animal. Open the door. Mom, you can't do this to us. We'll take what's ours. Mary Ann stood at the top of the stairs, her nightgown billowing slightly in the draft from the broken window. She felt no terror, only an almost surreal clarity. The boy she had once rocked to sleep was now a maniac pounding on her walls, demanding her life's savings. You already took what was yours, she murmured to herself. And more. The sirens wailed before Daniel could climb inside. Blue lights sliced through the dark, flooding the garden with authority. Officers stormed the property, their shouts cutting across Daniel's drunken curses. Clara's shrill voice rose in protest, but her words were drowned by the snap of handcuffs. From the porch, Mary Ann watched it all unfold, her arms folded across her chest. The neighbors gathered at a distance, their whispers buzzing like flies. Mr. Davis, the spiteful one, muttered something about, finally, as officers led Daniel away. Clara, mascara streaking her face, tried one last time to twist the narrative. She's confused. She doesn't know what she's doing. We're her family. But the police ignored her. One officer paused before Mary Ann. Ma'am, do you want to press charges? The question hung in the frosty air. For years, she had been incapable of saying no. Incapable of protecting herself. Tonight, under the starlit German sky, the words slid from her tongue like steel. Yes, Daniel roared, jerking against his restraints. Clara wailed. The officers pushed them toward the flashing cars, their cries fading into the night. Mary Ann stood alone on her porch, barefoot against the cold stone, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of sorrow and triumph. She whispered into the quiet. This ends now. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was not freedom won in court, nor peace after betrayal. It was finality, an ending that carved open the path for something entirely new. Spring arrived quietly in Stuttgart, and with it, Mary Ann's decision to leave the house that had become both her fortress and her battlefield. Too many ghosts lingered in its walls, the sound of Daniel's fists against the door. Clara's shrill laughter from the sofa she had bought. The echo of threats disguised as love. She sold it within a month, signing the papers with a hand that trembled not from doubt but from relief. With part of the money, she purchased a bright apartment near the city center, smaller, but filled with sunlight. When she opened the windows, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs drifted up, mingling with the sound of street musicians. It was not a mansion. It was not grand, but it was hers, untainted. The first morning there, she woke not to anxiety but to birdsong. She brewed her coffee and carried it to the balcony, where pots of geraniums already bloomed. A gift from Eleanor. Below, life bustled. Students rushing to class. Cyclists weaving through traffic. Children laughing as they tugged at their mother's hands. For the first time in decades, Marianne felt like she was part of life, not just a shadow financing someone else's. She joined Eleanor's garden club fully. No longer just a guest but a member. Every Thursday, she sat among women her age who carried their own scars. They spoke of grandchildren, travels, recipes, and sometimes of betrayals that still stung. But in that circle, pain was never the end of the story. Laughter always followed. Marianne found herself laughing too, loud and genuine, until her sides ached. One afternoon, the club organized a trip to the countryside. Marianne wore her burgundy dress, the one she had once bought as a rebellion, and when a fellow member teased, "Careful, Marianne, the farmers will fall in love with you," she laughed until tears filled her eyes. She had thought such moments lost forever. Her evenings were quiet, but no longer lonely. She painted in her new living room, canvases stacked against the wall like old friends waiting for their turn. Sometimes Eleanor dropped by with wine, and they would sit on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. Other times Marianne simply curled into her armchair with a book, marveling at how peaceful silence could be when it wasn't broken by demands. Every so often, she heard whispers about Daniel and Clara. Neighbors mentioned they had moved into a cramped flat on the city's edge, struggling to make ends meet. The news no longer pierced her. She felt neither vindictive nor merciful, only detached, as if they were characters in a play she had stopped attending. One evening, gazing at the stars above her balcony, Marianne whispered softly, "This is what Edward wanted for me. Not sacrifice, not endless giving, but peace." And for the first time, she believed it. By summer, Marianne had reinvented herself, not in grand gestures, but in steady, deliberate steps that stitched together a new life. She began with travel, a small suitcase, her passport long forgotten in a drawer, and a train ticket to Vienna. She had once dreamed of hearing an opera at the Staatsoper. But Daniel always needed money for emergencies, and Clara always needed another loan to cover some crisis. Now, nothing held her back. She sat in the balcony, the red velvet glowing under golden chandeliers, the music sweeping through her chest like a tide. She cried, not from sorrow, but from the sheer beauty of it, the reminder that the world still offered wonders she had denied herself for too long. From Vienna she went to Prague, then Budapest, her days filled with museums, long walks along rivers, and quiet cafe corners where no one knew her name. She took photographs, dozens of them, laughing at herself when she fumbled with the settings. A 71-year-old tourist. She joked aloud in her hotel room. And yet I feel 20 again. But Marianne did not spend only on herself. With part of the money from the house, she made donations to organizations protecting the elderly from financial abuse. The irony was not lost on her. She had once been a victim, silent and humiliated. Now, she became a patron, a voice for others who had not yet found the strength to say no. At one charity gala, she stood in front of a modest audience and shared her story, not with bitterness, but with pride. When she finished, the applause felt warmer than any forced, "Thank you, Daniel" or Clara had ever muttered. Back in Stuttgart, she discovered new hobbies. Painting remained her passion, but she also joined a local choir. Her voice was untrained, shaky at first, but the camaraderie of singing side by side filled her with joy. Sometimes she caught herself laughing so freely during rehearsals that younger members turned their heads in surprise. Marianne Holt, once a ghost in her own home, was now the woman whose laughter lit up the room. One evening, after rehearsal, she and Eleanor walked home together, their arms linked. "You look different, Marianne," Eleanor said softly. "Freer." Marianne smiled. "I am. I finally stopped living like I was a supporting character in someone else's story." On her balcony that night, she sipped a glass of wine and watched the city lights shimmer. There was no fear of the phone ringing, no dread of demands waiting on the other end. The silence was no longer hollow, it was rich, full, alive. She realized, with a kind of quiet awe, that she was not just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living. It was a rainy afternoon when the letter arrived. Marianne almost threw it away with the rest of the advertisements and bills. Until she saw the handwriting. Daniel's, untidy, hurried, the same crooked scrawl he used as a boy when writing her birthday cards. Her hands froze on the envelope. For a moment, her breath caught. She opened it with careful fingers. The words spilled across the page. Uneven and desperate. Mom, we don't know where else to turn. The debts have crushed us. Clara is sick, nothing serious. But we can't afford treatment. I lost my job. We're scared. I know we made mistakes. I know we hurt you. But please, if there's anything left in your heart for me, help us. Just this once. Your son, Daniel. The paper trembled in her hands. Rain pattered against the balcony door like a drumbeat, urging her to decide. She sat down slowly, the letter heavy in her lap. For years, she had dreamed of words like these: admission, apology, a cry for help not cloaked in arrogance. Yet now, faced with them, her heart was divided. One part remembered the little boy who once clung to her neck after nightmares, whispering, "Don't leave me, Mama." The other part remembered the man who had stood in court, calling her confused, incompetent, unfit to live freely. Eleanor found her like that an hour later, still staring at the page. "You've gone quiet," she said gently. Marianne handed her the letter. Eleanor read it, sighed, and placed it back on the table. Desperation makes even liars sound sincere. But you must ask yourself, are you moved by his pain? Or by your memory of who you wished he was? The words hit like a bell. Marianne leaned back, closing her eyes. What was she seeing now, her son's suffering? Or her own longing for a son who no longer existed? The storm outside grew louder, wind rattling the window frames. In that storm, Marianne felt her heart battle itself. The old instinct, to save and sacrifice, rose like a tide. Yet another voice, newer, stronger, pushed back. You have given enough, more than enough. When the rain eased, she picked up her pen. She wrote not a check, but a letter. Daniel, I read your words. I believe you are struggling. And I am sorry for your pain. But I cannot help you with money anymore. I must live the years I have left for myself. If you and Clara truly wish to rebuild a relationship, it must be based on respect, not dependence. Your mother, Marianne. She sealed it firmly, her hand steady. For the first time, she felt not guilt, but peace. The rain stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling gold across her balcony. Marianne stood there for a long while, breathing in the damp, clean air she had chosen. The reply came faster than Marianne expected. Not in ink, but in sound, the shrill ringing of her phone 2 days later. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Daniel's voice exploded through the receiver, raw and trembling. How could you do this? Mom? We bared our souls to you. Clara is sick. We're drowning here, and you sent us a lecture instead of help? Marianne closed her eyes, leaning back in her armchair. His words struck like darts. Yet the tone was all too familiar, not contrition, but accusation. Clara's voice pierced in next, high-pitched and frantic. You're cruel, Renata, after all we've given you. Marianne couldn't help it, she laughed. A short, sharp laugh that startled even her. Given me? She interrupted. What, exactly, did you give me? A wedding I wasn't invited to? A lawsuit to steal my money? Or perhaps the privilege of being treated like an ATM with wrinkles? The silence on the line was thick. For a moment, Marianne imagined them gaping like children caught lying. Then Daniel spat out. You'll regret this, when you're old and alone. Don't expect us to come running. She smiled, almost tenderly, though her words were steel. Daniel, I already am old, and I already am alone. The difference is, this time, it's a life I chose. And it's beautiful. The call ended with a click, their anger vanishing into the static. Marianne sat very still, listening to the hum of her apartment. The tension in her chest dissolved, replaced by an unexpected calm. She rose, walked to the balcony, and watched the city glow under the evening sun. Below, a child's laughter echoed from the bakery line, and the warm scent of bread drifted up. Life was happening, with or without Daniel and Clara. For the first time in months, Marianne felt no lingering shadow behind her. The chapter was closed, not torn in anger, but sealed in quiet finality. She whispered, half to herself, half to the heavens, "It's over." Then, as if the universe wanted to underline her words, a breeze lifted her hair and carried the last traces of bitterness away. If it were you, standing in Marianne's place, would you have answered the call? Would you have laughed at their hypocrisy, or hung up in silence? And tell me, do you believe family deserves endless chances? Or is there a point when enough is truly enough? The evening settled into a serene stillness. Marianne poured herself a glass of wine, lifted it toward the sky, and toasted, not to Daniel, not to Clara, but to herself. Freedom had never tasted so sweet. The months turned into seasons, and Marianne discovered that life after the storm could be unexpectedly beautiful. Stuttgart bloomed around her, and so did she. Her calendar filled with things she had once thought belonged only to other people. Weekend markets with Eleanor, choir rehearsals that ended with wine and laughter, afternoons painting in the park where children sometimes paused to peek at her canvases. She was no longer a shadow in her own life, she was a presence. Vibrant and unmistakable, yet the old wounds occasionally flickered. A newspaper headline about fraud, a passing mention of bankruptcy in conversation, it all reminded her of Daniel and Clara. The pain had dulled, but it still lived inside her like a scar. One evening, at a cafe with friends, someone joked, "At least your son gave you stories worth telling." The table erupted in laughter. And to her own surprise, Marianne laughed too. It was sharp, then soft, like the release of a knot she had carried too long. She added, "If betrayal were currency, I'd be a billionaire by now." The group roared. Humor, once bitter, now became her shield and her weapon. But it wasn't all noise and laughter. There were evenings when the world grew quiet, when the city lights flickered beyond her window, and Marianne sat alone in her armchair. In those moments, she let herself feel everything, the weight of years given away. The sting of rejection, the loneliness of loving people who never loved her back. She did not hide from it anymore. The silence was no longer suffocating, it was honest. The highest point of this new chapter came on her 72nd birthday. Eleanor and the choir surprised her with a gathering in the garden square. Lanterns hung from the trees. Music floated through the night. And Marianne found herself surrounded, not by people who needed her money, but by people who cherished her laughter, her stories, her presence. As they sang to her, she felt tears prick her eyes, not the tears of loss, but of gratitude. She looked at the faces lit by candlelight and thought, "This is family, not by blood, not by obligation, but by choice." Later that night, alone on her balcony, she poured herself a final glass of wine. The city was hushed. The stars clear. She raised the glass, not in bitterness, not in defiance, but in peace. To freedom, she whispered, to love that asks for nothing in return. The words lingered in the still air. And for once, Marianne knew with absolute certainty, her story was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had reclaimed. The storm had passed, and in its place, she had found herself. In the quiet of her 72nd year, Marianne finally understood what life had been trying to teach her all along. Love that must be bought is not love at all. Family bound by need alone will dissolve when the well runs dry. She had spent decades believing her worth was measured in what she could give, what she could sacrifice, what she could endure. But standing now at the twilight of her days, she realized, dignity is not selfishness. Choosing oneself is not cruelty. The storm had stolen much from her, money, trust, illusions, yet in its ruthless wake, it had given her something rarer, clarity, the freedom to laugh again, the courage to live for herself, the wisdom to see that peace is not found in others' approval, but in the stillness of one's own heart. Marianne lifted her final canvas onto the easel, a self-portrait. Not of the woman who once bowed under demands, but of the woman who rose from them. Her eyes shone with lines of age, but also with light, unbought, unbroken. The brushstroke lingered, and she smiled. Her story was no longer a tragedy. It was a reclamation. And as the evening light settled into her apartment, the silence was not empty. It was full, full of freedom, full of herself,